Hello, welcome to the Bonnieville Mennonite church service. I am glad you are here. I have 3 candles in there, so we'll see if we can get at least one other lit. Today we are looking at Acts 20, 7 through 12. I'm going to go ahead and read it. On the first day of the week, we came together to break bread. Paul spoke to the people, and because he intended to leave the next day, kept on talking until midnight. There were many lamps in the upstairs room where we were meeting. Seated in a window was a young man named Eutychus, who was sinking into a deep sleep as Paul talked on and on. When he was sound asleep, he fell to the ground from the 3rd story and was picked up dead. Paul went down, threw himself on the young man, and put his arms around him. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "He's alive." Then he went upstairs again and broke bread and ate. After talking until daylight, he left. The people took the young man home alive and were greatly comforted. I'm curious how many of you all listening have heard this story before. And if you would, go down to the comments and tell me if you've heard this story before. Because I don't know why, but this week was the first time I had ever heard this story. When I'm unsure of what to preach on, when I'm not inspired by any of the lectionary texts, I will often Google weird stories from the Bible, a process which has yet to fail me. This story was one of the ones that popped up when I Googled weird stories from the Bible, alongside talking donkeys and cooking with excrement and all of the other strange things you can find in the Bible. This story is so bizarre and seemingly random, it's hard to even know what to say about it. All I know is that this will not be a long sermon. I will not make the same mistakes as Paul and literally bore anyone to death. I can empathize with this poor fellow. The fledgling community of Jesus followers would often meet up at night because that was the only time that most people could gather, especially the slaves who were bound to their duties during the day. So they would gather after the day's work is done, settle down for a meal, and then listen to someone speak on scripture or whatever was on their heart. This means that poor Eutychus, who was probably in the age range of 8 to 14, he'd been working all day long. He'd probably just filled his stomach with his first proper meal of the day, or week even, and then he was lulled to sleep by I lost my spot. He was lulled to sleep by the candlelight and the monotonous drone of Paul's voice. If you have ever read one of Paul's letters, you will know that he is incredibly detail-oriented, very meticulous in his logic, and incredibly long-winded. I can just imagine the rise and fall of his voice turning into a lullaby, beckoning Eutychus into a deep slumber. This might have been a cute and funny anecdote that Eutychus would have told his kids when they ask him for a bedtime story, if not for the tragic twist of this tale. I would imagine it would go something like this. Picture Eutychus gathering toddlers in his lap, a fire popping and crackling, lighting up the twilight-filled room. "Tell us a story," the kids demanded, excited for a nightly ritual. Okay, Eutychus would say, faking reluctance as his eyes sparkled. "One time, the most famous evangelist came to town to preach. You'll never guess who it was. The oldest raises his hand. Was it Peter? No, it wasn't Peter. Good guess, though. It was Paul. I know, right? I was so excited to hear him. I had been hearing rumors that he would come to Troas, but I could hardly believe that Paul, the Paul, would come to our little town, let alone that I would be able to be in the same room as him, even break bread with him. The night was going well. We had a delicious shared meal together, and I stuffed myself to the brim. Starving after a long day's labor in the field, I was still licking my fingers as I settled by the window to hear him speak. The cool night air felt delightful on my skin. The room glowed with countless oil lamps, illuminating Paul in all of his apostle glory. I tried not to fidget in anticipation for the words he would bring about Jesus, the Messiah. However, despite my best intentions, as soon as he started to speak, I immediately fell asleep and missed the whole entire thing. People were laughing at me, at my obnoxious snoring, the fact that I had drool dripping down my gaping mouth. You can imagine how mortified I was when they eventually shook me awake. There you go, kids. That's the story of the time I could have heard Paul speak, but I slept instead. I even remember dreaming of a man in sandals reaching out his hand to me, when I was lost away in some rocks. Unfortunately, that is not the story that would come of this eventful night, or not fully. Instead of Eutychus sleeping peacefully, which is perhaps embarrassing but still amusing, not only did he fall asleep, but he fell right out of the window, plummeting all 3 floors down to the unforgiving ground below. A promising party story turned a tragic cautionary tale in the blink of an eye. Horrified, those who witnessed this fatal fall quickly gathered to see if he was all right. We can assume he died instantly, the height of the fall too much for his little body. Paul didn't hesitate to act. He immediately sprinted down to where Eutychus lay. The horrified crowd watched on as a distraught Paul flung himself down onto the boy. Disregarding his status as a dignified religious leader, Paul abandoned all pretense and poise, losing himself in a healing embrace. This would have been a strange sight indeed. Grown men, especially with Paul's status, did not often subject themselves to such humiliating displays of grief. We can only guess if Paul knew that his embrace would be miraculous or not. I like to think that Paul acted on instinct, the reality of this traumatic moment compelling him to react in such an odd way. Either way, as Paul clung tightly to this boy, he felt a faint but distinct heartbeat. Or he heard a gasp of air escape Eutychus, the promise of life still thrumming in his little body. "Don't worry," Paul yelled out, trying to comfort the terrified crowd. "There is still life in him. He is alive. It's a miracle, like many prophets before him, Elijah, Elisha, not to mention Jesus. Paul had found life where others only saw death." This Sunday is traditionally known as All Saints' Day, a day where we, as the body of believers, take the time to remember and celebrate the lives of those who came before us. Within this tradition is a belief that there is a strong connection that lives on between those who are living and those who have passed away. As most of you know, I have participated in 2 funerals this month, grieving, remembering, and celebrating the lives of Sibylla Mast and Kathy Breinheimer. This month has also been full of surgeries, illness, and constant fear of the pandemic. It can begin to feel as if death is all around us. Not to mention Election Day looming just around the corner. No matter who gets elected, there will be grief for those whose expectations and hopes for our world have been denied. We go through our days with a nugget of knowledge tickling the back of our mind. This nugget whispers fears fears of tragedy, death, disease, loss. I'm not sure about you, but sometimes my mind likes to torture me, I guess, for lack of a better phrase. I'll be minding my business and suddenly a thought jumps up in my mind, like some sick pop-up ad. Hey, Nick could be dead. He could have been hit by a car and you have no idea. What? Why, brain? Why? I was just trying to make my bed for goodness sake. Apparently our brains will run tragic scenarios like this as an attempt to prepare our psyche for trauma and loss. Same thing goes for nightmares. It's like our bodies instinctively know that we live in a world of loss and pain, so it does its best to build up a defense so that we are ready when tragedy hits. Of course, anyone who has experienced sudden tragic loss will tell you that there's no way to prepare for such devastation. It hits you like a truck. It steals your breath away, leaving you reeling. One time, I was talking with my therapist about this, about my fears of Nick dying, the feeling that if something would happen to him or any of my loved ones, my life would be over. And she looked me in the eye and said, Mariah, if Nick were to die, of course you would be devastated, but you must remember, you must know that you would still be okay. Maybe not right away, but life goes on and so will you. That doesn't mean that you just forget and move on from loss, but just like your body heals from a physical wound, you will heal. Life finds a way. It was like she was looking into my soul and calling out resilience that I forget is inside of me. It's like when my dad and I were on our hike in Colorado, one of the hardest physical feats that I've accomplished in a long time. And at one point we were debating whether or not we should continue on to the top. And my dad looked at me and he said, Mariah, you have the legs and the lungs. Let's do this. You have the legs and the lungs. Let's do this. My therapist saw resilience. My dad saw strength. These qualities are in every single one of us. They are in you. They might take different forms, whether that be spiritual resilience, emotional resilience, physical strength, or strength of character. But either way, there is no doubt in my mind that they are alive in you. Even when it doesn't feel like it, or especially when it doesn't feel like it, you have the ability to move forward, even if it means slugging through despair, grief, heartbreak, utter disappointment. Look at what Paul did after Eutychus fell. He went right back upstairs and continued preaching, not stopping until the sun rose. We can look at Paul's response to Eutychus in one of two ways. One, Paul did not learn his lesson about the dangers of long-winded sermons. Or, Paul modeled for us a response to tragedy. Granted, this trauma did have a happy ending with the boy's miraculous survival, but he still fell out of a window. Paul still ran down to this boy, held his lifeless body to his chest, perhaps even cried out in anguish until he felt the spark of life within him. You can't tell me that Paul's heart wasn't racing, his blood almost drunk with adrenaline as he made his ascent and resumed his preaching. Paul models in a strange way a way of responding to the extremes of life. You just keep moving forward. After the election, our country may be different, forever changed. And what do? No matter the response, we keep moving forward. We keep healing. We keep praying. We keep marching. We keep building, creating, mending. We keep loving, trying, teaching, dancing. We keep failing, practicing, lamenting, rejoicing. We fall and we get back up. No matter what tragedy guts us, we are still the church. A church still sparkling with the lives of the saints who came before us. People from the Bible, early church history, and our loved ones. We are in good company. That means that even as we pass away, we will join this vibrant river carving peace, grace, reconciliation, justice, restoration, unconditional love, and life into the very fabric of the world. We are called to look for life where others see death. We are called to create safe places for children and youth. We are called to be a safety net to catch people when they fall. We are called to light lamps and listen deep into the night for God's voice. We are called to respond to tragedy with heart-wrenching embrace. We are called to resilience and strength to keep going even when it seems as if all is lost. We are called to proclaim this is not the end in the face of darkness. We are called to speak life into death, knowing that death and decay do not have the final word. No matter what, if you are plunged into darkness, listen for the heartbeat. Listen for the gasp of air. Listen for the voice calling out, there is life. There is life indeed. Amen. I will leave you today with these words of blessing. May you go from this place with the God of resilience and strength alive and well within you, calling out that fire within you, listening for the heartbeats, for the gasp of air, for life. There is life indeed. Go in peace.